Gold plays a role on central bank balance sheets, right? There's actors that hold significant amounts of gold, right? The United States actually, as a percentage of its GDP, I think is at one of the lowest points of its gold holdings, right? It's moving away from that. And I think the drive towards gold is driven primarily by some sort of desperation, I would call it, to try to get away from sovereign debt, try to get away from the dollar. I don't think it works for a variety of structural reasons, because in the system, as much as people in the Bitcoin space focus on the central banks and governments, I still think the commercial banks play a huge role. The commercial banks, due to a lot of regulation, international Basel liquidity requirements, they have to hold treasuries. Okay, so like they're legally obligated. If you want to operate in a heavily regulated system of banking infrastructure, they're obligated to hold these treasuries, and gold does not provide a alternative to them under current law. Now, there's some exceptions to that at the margin, but I'm just speaking generally because we were short on time here. Now, what I would say is, like, the fact that countries and entities are desperate for gold or some alternative to the dollar shows you how prolific and powerful and hegemonic the dollar is. And it is not an argument against the dollar. In fact, it's an argument against the decline of the dollar, which people consistently try to parrot and repeat. I think over the next 10 years, the dollar is more likely to strengthen relative to other foreign currencies than it is to weaken. I'm a big believer in the dollar milkshake theory, in that idea. And I think where does Bitcoin play in this? Bitcoin, and again, don't take this the wrong way because I'm very bullish on Bitcoin, it plays a trivial role currently globally in the financial and monetary systems. It is not big enough. It's not liquid enough. There aren't enough players. There aren't enough leverage that can be provided. Whereas, there are entities I'm available that will give you substantial leverage against gold holdings. The same is not true for Bitcoin. You have to have niche players that are not provide. I'm talking, tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of leverage that can come through various different entities, for example, levering treasuries, which are legally mandated to be reserve assets. So to me, like, these ideas to say, like, oh, Bitcoin's the new oil, or we're going to settle things in Bitcoin, I think that eventually we move in that direction where it becomes a global reserve. But I think it becomes a global reserve in the way that treasuries are a global reserve, where the banking systems themselves are holding it. And that is what needs to change first. People tend to overemphasize the importance of central banks and underestimate the importance of commercial banks, and particularly shadow banks, which we don't even have much insight into. So all this is to say, in a long way, that I think that the idea that people float out there is one that's more of aspiration than any real data or fact. Even the Trump administration, again, they're talking about, like, the strategic importance of Bitcoin, having a Bitcoin reserve. But keep in mind, they also hold corn as a strategic reserve. They also hold, a variety of different. I think they have honey as a strategic reserve. A variety of different, commodities are held. Just because it's held as a strategic reserve does not mean that is somehow, the underpinning of the global financial or monetary system. And it's also not, to me, negative on Bitcoin or its role where it could move there. But I think we're decades away from that. I don't think that I don't think we're in the twilight of fiat, as some people on FinTwit will try to tell you. I think we got a long runway.
Do you think I'll get your thoughts on BRICS here briefly, but do you think it is a gradually and suddenly moment, or do you think, and you alluded to this earlier, do you think it is more of a whimper? Like, do you think these systems just kind of just chug along parallel to each other for a few decades, and they kind of just start changing basically, and as older generations go away and sunset, and then the newer generations come up and be like, what the hell are we doing? Is that kind of just how you see it playing out?
I look at something that's going to change sort of the structure of the market. Okay. That's the key thing. So I'll tell you, my bias is that I think it's going to take a lot longer than people expect. That's my bias. I could be totally wrong on that, but what I don't really find that to be particularly interesting, because all I need to do is I need to look at signs, okay, of real stress. Okay. And here's what I know to be the case. There are numerous fiat currencies that are much weaker than the dollar, and they're not failing. Okay. You see some people point to Argentina. You see people point to Zimbabwe, right? Like countries at the margin. But even those countries, like, they somehow in many ways are able to muddle along and make it work for longer than people think. So the reason I start there is that before the dollar is truly threatened, before the euro is truly threatened, before these other currencies are really, in the basket, I think that you're going to see other widespread failures of economies. And the question then becomes like, what do they do at that point? Do they dollarize? Which I think that most people don't actually appreciate, that there is some effort in emerging markets to consistently become dollarized, which here's that. If that occurs,
that plays into tether and stable coins, right?
yeah. I mean, look, we could see a situation where dollar dominance rises for the next 30 years and more of the alternatives to the dollar are driven out, right? That there's so much of a desire for dollars. To me, that's not the end of fiat. That's not the end of collapsing government securities. Now, in that dynamic, Bitcoin can do really well. Bitcoin can surge north of, $2 to $5, $10 million, right? But it doesn't mean that the current big gorilla in the system is just disappearing. So, my view is like the BRICS. BRICS is a perfect example. They recognize the system's not fair to them. They're recognizing they're being abused. They're desperate to try to come up with a solution, and they're struggling. Okay, full stop. They are trying to figure out something that they can work and something they can agree to, and it's problematic. What are the challenges for them? The challenges are they're very different countries, and depending on how the currency they propose, or I know that I've read some different ideas that they floated out there. There's some people that would benefit. Some people would be sort of more disadvantaged from moving to what some of the proposals they have are. So from my standpoint, is like it's a collective action problem. How do you get them to agree, and how do you force them to agree? And then even if the countries, even if the governments agree, what about the private citizens? Because private citizens have the ability to say, okay, I understand that you're trying to use this BRICS currency, but we really just want dollars. And you brought up George Gammon, so I'll raise one point I'm in violent agreement with him on. Okay. One thing that I think is difficult for us as Western American or Canadian Bitcoiners to grapple with is that many countries across the world who have citizens who have been fortunate enough to hold dollars, they have seen the cost of goods and services in their local economies decline. I want to repeat that. By holding dollars, they're getting more food, they're getting more energy, they're getting more housing in their local economy. So it's not just, people say, oh, it's just the cleanest dirty shirt, all fiat's going to zero, it's all disappearing. No, I held $100,000 and I live in, an emerging market. My $100,000 can now buy more house. It can buy more cars. It can buy more groceries. Okay. That's really important to understand, because they don't view inflation of the dollar in the same way we do. They view it in the sense of like, if I just hold dollars, that's all I got to do. I'll have more money in 2 years. I'll be able to afford more. Now, many of them can't. They're very poor. They can't hold dollars, or they don't have access to dollars, which is another problem. But what does that look like in a world where, everybody with a smartphone can get access to USDC or USDT? And this is why I think, I always say you should trust what the message the market's telling you. The market is telling you that there is overwhelming demand for stables in emerging markets. And why is that? It's because there's demand for the dollar, and they trust the dollar. And you shouldn't discount that if you're trying to read the tea leaves of when this big transition or the big crash happens. Don't overlook that. I mean, that tells you the dollar is still, the preferred currency medium of exchange in the world.
Using George as a placeholder here. But, he was battling people again the other day. It's like, well, so much for a store of value for Bitcoin, CPI or whatever. And it was just like consumer price inflation. It was like, yeah, Bitcoin's not a store of value for that in the short term. And people, it's monetary inflation, George. How do you, because my question is, again, just liquidity going forward, global M2, stuff like that. How do you see liquidity just globally, kind of wrapping this whole macro part of this up? Where do you see things kind of headed in that sense? And how do you see Bitcoin shaping that and trying to put a pin in that? If you want the answer to that question right there, and you like that spicy clip, check it out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. But if you want the full interview in its entirety, all the spicy clips put together, and you're not going to want to miss it, believe me, then check that out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. Do it.